My friend took this footage of one of the fires that ravaged Los Angeles.
Dude, that's literally right there.
There's a building on the side of the freeway.
Thank God for our first responders.
The selflessness of a firefighter, we aren't thinking about ourselves. We might be thinking about our family, the victims, but we aren't thinking about ourselves. So when we see people have the spirit and the fortitude to turn around and support not only one another, but us as we get back from whatever task it might be, gives you a little pick-me-up.
Our guest today is a 21-year veteran of the Columbia, Missouri Fire Department, holding the ranks of firefighter, engineer, lieutenant, and battalion chief. He's also my brother-in-law. I'd like to welcome Gary L. Warren Jr. Thank you for joining us, bro.
Thank you for having me, Terrence, and hello to your fans and followers.
Appreciate it, brother. Appreciate that. Fires have burned at least 40,000 acres, at least 24 people have died, and at least 12,000 homes have been either destroyed or damaged. Can you give us some insight into what firefighters might be going through during this time?
Yeah, and first of all, we need to hold everyone, not just the firefighters, but all of the victims, even the family pets. We need to, say a prayer for all of them. But two of the biggest issues for firefighters when you have these type of ongoing long-term incidents becomes um, fatigue, and that fatigue kind of holds two different aspects, if you will. The first being the obvious one, the physical fatigue, long shifts, short periods of rest. The other is an emotional fatigue, or what we often refer to as compassion fatigue, where you have exposure to incidents over a long period of time, which that stress wears down on you emotionally. It can also manifest physically and make it exponentially harder to do the duties that are required of you.
With you saying that, and I didn't even plan on going in this direction at all, but it just kind of makes me think about how some of this, unfortunately, has sort of been politicized. I've heard criticisms about people not keeping firefighters there into overtime. I've heard criticisms about where the mayor was when all of this started. You have any thoughts about that? Because I feel like we can kind of lose sight of what this is all about. We can lose sight of how victims are affected. We can lose sight of the fact that we're dealing with individuals who are firefighters. But you have any comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. You'll have to forgive me for comparing public servants to soldiers, but that's kind of the closest comparison, if you will. There aren't Republican or Democrat firefighters in an incident like this. There are just firefighters who are tasked with trying to preserve life and limit damage to property. And so, in the process of doing that job, it's not fruitful or helpful to draw those political lines, those invisible lines that we can't even see. It has no benefit whatsoever to the task at hand. Firefighters need money, they need bodies, and they need support in order to get the job done. And none of those things have anything to do with political affiliation.
I think a lot of the things that people are doing these days have just been so unfruitful. One of the things that comes to mind, especially in light of the fact that we're dealing with human beings, we're dealing with people who have lost lives, we're dealing with people who have lost homes. I've even heard people not have as much compassion because they say, oh, well, those are, big, beautiful homes. They can kind of rebound because they must have the means. And so my brother, and I know know you personally, you're a very upstanding guy. So I'm really interested in your perspective about this. Mine is that it doesn't matter if they have means. These are human beings. These are people who have raised their kids in homes. They may have had a mother who had dementia that they were taking care of. We don't know people's story, regardless of how we perceive their means. What are your thoughts about all those attitudes that people have?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate because what gets lost is at the end of the day, These are the possessions that belong to a person. And just like I don't know the value of your possessions beyond, a monetary amount that is placed by the bank. We don't know what this home means to you. In some instances, these may be homes that a person was raised in and was handed down to them. It may be the first home that a person was afforded to buy because they landed the big acting gig that they worked so hard for. So those things are inconsequential when it comes to what is needed at this time, which is compassion and above all, a way to mitigate this ongoing incident, which this is becoming unprecedented, the amount of damage and the length of time that this has been going on. And so it really kind of strikes me that there would be people that would take that attitude and opinion about a person's ability to replace something, because regardless if they have the ability or not, there's still the same feeling of helplessness when you lose everything that you own.
Right. Thank you for helping to bring that human nature to the victims, the people who have gone through this. Can we delve into the human nature as far as the firefighter? I mean,
Yeah,
I can only imagine what they've been going through, what they experience. I mean, even just those who have may have found people who were deceased. Can you give us an idea of what the firefighter human element might look like?
yeah, it is very simple. The root cause of this, we know what it is. It's the incident itself, but the complexities lie in how they affect firefighters, both as a group and individually, and then your family. Because on the one hand, you have the length of time that this incident has gone on, and it makes it very, it's well documented the recovery efforts that happened during 9/11, or rather shortly after 9/11, and how those things were actually harder on the responders than the initial response, because the initial response was a very small group of people. It was the ongoing response that involved scores of rescuers and cadaver dogs and things of that nature. So when you take a look at that and you say, how does that relate to this? Probably the most difficult thing for a firefighter, because the job is hard enough as it is. But when things hit close to home, when your neighborhood burns and you still have to go report to duty, when your home is lost and you have to report to duty, and you're wondering how your wife or your girlfriend or your husband or your boyfriend, your children, those things don't go away just like reporting to duty doesn't. And so that becomes the struggle. It's hard enough to do the job, and trying to say, what makes up a firefighter is like trying to generalize what makes up an athlete. They're all different. And so there are, they have different levels of mental toughness and different levels of physical ability. And all of those things play a role in how you respond to something like this. But what we know from countless papers and researches is that the longer that firefighters go through this, the more they are susceptible to things like compassion fatigue and the emotional stress that comes with just the duration of this incident. And then, of course, when you lose things, you think about it yourself. How difficult would it be to go to your job knowing that you just lost your possessions to a fire? Now, make yourself a firefighter who has to go to your job knowing that you lost all of your possessions, but then you're actually actively trying to mitigate fires and or rescue people and pets and et cetera and so on.
Is PTSD a big issue with firefighters?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the sad and unfortunate thing is the amount of time that we have taken to actually recognize, and it's kind of a result of those things not coming to fruition because we fought all of those things with soldiers. We sent them off to war, and they come back and they're not the same. And the family members can say something is different about, you know fill in the blank. And it took a long time before hospitals acknowledged it and medical professionals acknowledged it. And we see the same thing in the fire service. It was probably about 10 to 15 years ago that they first acknowledged that PTSD existed. Um, I myself, being a veteran of the fire service, have struggled with PTSD for quite a long time. Even when I go home, it's not so much being home, it's being around things that remind me of the calls that I went on. An infant that died in my arms, a person who committed suicide, someone who, rigged their house for explosive devices to take us out. All of those reminders are around. And that's kind of the challenge when you deal with PTSD, because for most people, there is the shock of the incident, there is the aftermath of the incident, and then when things quiet and those possessions get replaced and they relocate, they tend to move on emotionally, and they slowly get better. Well, for a lot of firefighters, the scars are there, and that's exactly what they are. You may come back to your neighborhood, or you may run on a call in what used to be your neighborhood, and you no longer live there. And the house on the corner that you had with all of the beautiful yard work you did now belongs to something or someone else. And PTSD is a real thing. It goes so much further than this incident.
Mhm.
It'll be weeks, months, years after this incident that the men and women responding to these calls will have to deal with the wake of that. And for some of them, they may not have recovered from past incidents, and this has just brought everything,
Go
back
ahead.
into to their lap again.
Yeah. What advice would you have for your brothers, firefighters, dealing with that, dealing with all of this, yet trying to
Mhm.
help other people?
My advice isn't just limited to them, because one of the things that firefighters have that a lot of people don't understand is kind of a warped sense of humor. And it is literally something where you have to laugh sometimes to keep from crying. And that's how you do the job. But the challenge becomes when you know someone and you know they aren't right, and you have to call them on that. And that responsibility doesn't belong to just the firefighters. It unfortunately belongs to spouses, boyfriends and girlfriends, family members who know them best, because a firefighter will do one of two things. They'll either be quiet or they'll talk. And you can't force information, you can't coax it out of them. You have to find those instances where they're willing to talk and then engage. And so that becomes part of it. Certainly utilizing peer counseling, EAP programs, any of those things that exist. We have to set aside our pride and take advantage of those tools, because they are there to help us get past some of those emotional blocks that we may have, or those emotional responses that we may have. And so um, there's also support for the spouses themselves, because they carry a lot. They know when their husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend isn't right.
Mm.
And they may be able to soothe that comfort. But imagine being the wife, husband, spouse, whatever, of a person, and you see them go out the door. That creates a whole different set of circumstances as well. Because on the one hand, you have people who are worried for their life of their loved one. And then you also have people who don't respond well and say, "You're leaving, and we have all of this to deal with."
Right.
So
That's a lot. That's a lot to carry. I mean, not only for the individual, but also for the family. Thank you for that insight. How can the general public be supportive of the efforts of firefighters?
there's a lot of different ways, and it doesn't take anything special. People who are active in their church, or if you are active in a group like the Rotary Club, or if you volunteer with the American Red Cross, all of these entities, these organizations have always played a role. They provide aid. They do the same thing for us that we do for people on a structure fire when they've lost their home. We try to save as much as we can. We try to transition them to temporary housing. Well, these same things can be reciprocated to firefighters. Let's acknowledge the difference between natural cover or wildland firefighter and a structural firefighter. A structural firefighter primarily deals with emergencies that revolve around commercial or residential structures, and of course, accidents on the street, hazardous materials, things of those natures. The uniqueness of that is that for a structural firefighter, if you can get out of the building, you're for the most part out of danger. But for that strike team that's doing natural cover firefighting or wildland firefighting, you have a resource problem. Oftentimes, the fires are in remote areas. You can only take what you can carry. And then fuel, which is what makes a fire burn, is all around you. It's all of that vegetation. And with a structure fire, if the conditions are right, we can put that out and limit it to just that structure. But we can't control the wind. And you all have had winds in excess of 40, 50, 60 miles per hour.
100 miles
Yeah,
when this first kicked off. Yeah.
exactly. And those things fuel it. So we have to kind of acknowledge those differences. When we look at that and we talk about what does support look like for those firefighters, when they get done, the only break that they might have is one where it's enough for them to eat, sleep, and go back to what they were doing. And so having someone there to hand you cold water or a warm cup of coffee or serve you a meal, blanket on your back, a dry t-shirt, those things are so helpful. And it really is a morale boost because you can see, the selflessness of a firefighter. We aren't thinking about ourselves. We might be thinking about our family, the victims, but we aren't thinking about ourselves. So when we see people have the spirit and the fortitude to turn around and support not only one another, but us as we get back from whatever task it might be, gives you a little pick me up.
Yeah.
And so that type of thing could really help. And so I would encourage, people who are in your area, people watching your show, if you want to help, you may think that you can't, but honestly, if you're in an area that's safe, contact the American Red Cross and see if they need volunteers, someone to serve food, to do whatever, because those things help.
That's awesome. That is great advice. I am hoping that we as a community can come together to try to help the victims and support the firefighters as much as we can. And I really appreciate your feedback and your expertise in this area. Thanks for coming on, my brother.
Thank you for having me. And if you allow me one other thing, I would also challenge your viewers and anyone who may watch this, because this is applicable to any and everyone. Those warnings typically come out well in advance. We see them down here in Houston. I've retired, I've moved here in Houston, and you see the hurricane and some people almost laugh them off. We've been through hurricane fill in the blank, so how will this one be much different? Those warnings typically come early, and so take heed to those warnings. Have a plan in place of who you will go see or where you will go. Because when an incident like this is going on, there's two modes. There's the mode where you try to mitigate the incident. We're trying to put out the fire. We're trying to limit damage to property. And then there's rescue, which speaks for itself, where you have to extricate people from dangerous situations. Rescue requires so much more manpower than mitigation does. Not that mitigation does, but rescue requires more manpower, because while you're rescuing people, we also have to have measures in place and teams in place to protect us, safety officers, et cetera, et cetera. And so people heed those warnings and have a plan in place. As hard as it is to leave behind those possessions, they're not worth your life.
Yeah.
Most often possessions can be replaced. You cannot be.
I tried to put myself in the mind frame of the people who have gone through this when they were asking people to evacuate early, they were actually telling them to not to lock your door. And I
Hmm.
guess so that the firefighters, could have access. And then we see other stories where, unfortunately, people who are actually looting and
Hmm.
taking advantage of the situation. How can somebody follow the rules yet still be concerned about their possessions?
I guess, and that's where it comes back to your possessions versus your life. I get it. We work so hard for the things we have. I'm dealing with an Amazon issue right now. And
Yeah.
we've kind of talked, a little bit about that. But trust me, if danger comes tomorrow, we're out of here. We're out of here tonight. We're not going to wait till tomorrow. And that is the thing that is always, been so difficult for me to watch so far away. I've seen these countless videos where people have tried to wait it out. And now you're in a situation where you're surrounded by fire, surrounded by smoke, and you're trying to leave and you don't know which direction to go.
Yeah. I was flabbergasted, brother-in-law, because when this was really breaking out initially, I saw this massive fire on one of the news stations, and someone was actually looking around the corner. Two people were actually looking around the corner from their balcony at the
Mhm.
fire. And I'm standing at the TV. I'm like, you guys have got to go. I know that this can be easy for some people to say if they haven't lost everything, but you can replace stuff, but you can't replace human life. I
No.
like that advice that you gave about, following the directions and do what you're told to do.
Yeah, and again, it really it's awful that we have people in our society that would take advantage of a situation like that. At the end of the day, when you think about what has to be done in terms of mitigating the incident, if we want to help firefighters, the first and best thing that we can do is to not become part of that incident. And that's by heeding the warnings, evacuating, when you're directed to do so, so that firefighters can concentrate on mitigation efforts and not have to switch mode to rescue effort. Because they're very skilled at it and they're very good at it. But you can only do one thing at a time, effectively.
Well, I want to thank you. Thanks again, brother, for coming in. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, and our hearts go out to those who have been affected, and we're going to be praying for them. Thank you.
Absolutely.